I heard you
This
don't
one
have a
is
wife.
different.
My daughters are
She
perfect
looks
for
at
you,
you as
said the
if you
old Apache
belong
woman
here.
I helped.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The trading stop sat low at the edge of a dry stretch of land, less than 30 paces from the San Pedro River South Bend. Built from scavenged boards and half-rotted canvas, the place served as a barter post more than a store. No signs, no clerk, just a handful of men who came when they pleased and left when their business was done. That afternoon, the heat was stiff and sharp, resting heavy on shoulders and forcing sweat even for men who'd grown used to sun. The cottonwoods nearby gave shade that barely reached the ground. A trail horse stood tied loosely to a post, flicking flies with its tail. Silas Mercer approached on foot. He'd left his mare hitched 100 yards back under a mesquite tree. He didn't like crowding her where other animals kicked. He carried nothing in hand, only a coin pouch tied inside his coat and a short list in his mind: salt, maybe a strap of leather, and lamp wick if it could be had. He didn't come here often, only when he had to. Silas was 39. Not old, but not young either. His face looked settled, like time had shaped it into something firm and unreadable. He didn't talk much. He'd been part of a trail outfit once, hauling freight across the desert, managing ox teams. But that ended 5 years back when a wrong turn during monsoon season cost him 2 men under his watch. After that, he sold his rig, took what money he had left, and built a cabin farther west, where the land was cheaper and the neighbors didn't ask questions. Now, his days were spent tending a piece of worn land and keeping to himself. That suited him fine. As he stepped up to the edge of the post, he caught sight of 2 men leaning over a table. Their tone was flat but edged. One of them, broad across the back, maybe 35, with a sharp mouth, was speaking over an older Apache woman. She stood behind a woven basket. Inside were hand-coiled ropes, shaped wood, and maybe 2 pairs of moccasins. The man held one moccasin in his hand and twisted it, like testing its worth. But his price was a joke. The woman didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead, not at the men, not at anyone. Her clothes were travel-worn, her shawl layered for sun, her eyes still. Silas watched from a few steps back. He didn't know her, didn't know what tribe she came from, but he saw clearly what was happening. The men had no intention of paying fair. They didn't care who she was or how far she'd come. They were there to cut her down with price, not trade. He moved in then, 2 steps forward, no noise, no show. He didn't reach for anything, just stood there beside her, near enough to block the wind if it had been blowing, close enough to signal they weren't alone now. The man holding the moccasin looked up, annoyed at first. Then he saw Silas. His face changed, not to fear, but to calculation. Silas didn't look threatening, but he didn't look like a man who backed away either. "Something you need?" the man asked. Silas didn't answer. He glanced once at the moccasin still in the man's hand, then slowly down at the basket. He crouched and lifted it, checked the contents, and then stood. He reached into his coat, took out 5 silver coins, and placed them in the woman's open palm without touching her. His hand pulled back fast, not out of fear, but because he respected the line. The men didn't say another word. They turned, made a few half-hearted comments, and left. Silas stayed a second longer, looking down at the old woman. Her face gave nothing away, but he saw how her fingers closed tight around the coins, how her jaw settled in a firmer line. She didn't speak, didn't nod, just picked up her basket and walked off toward the trees. Silas turned and walked to the trade bench. He asked about salt, got in a cloth bundle. The lamp wick was too short for the price they wanted, so he left it. He paid and left with no small talk. The ride home was quiet. His mare moved easy beneath him, used to the trail. He glanced back once toward the direction the woman had gone, but saw no one. The river curve vanished behind scrub and hills. At the cabin, he unloaded slow. The yard was dry and cracked, but the well still held. Chickens scratched near the fence. His dog, a lean brown mutt, lay in the shade and didn't move. Inside, everything was as he left it, bedroll tucked, shelves clean, the stove swept from breakfast ash. He poured water into the basin, washed his hands, then sat on the porch. The sun dipped lower, turning the dust red. Somewhere a hawk called. He didn't think he'd done anything remarkable. He hadn't interfered for praise or reward. He just couldn't watch someone be cheated in plain daylight. He didn't need thanks. He didn't want company. Still, something in his chest felt tight, like the kind of tight that didn't pass with breath. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this one simple act, would change his life's direction more than any trail ride, storm, or accident had before. He just didn't see it coming. Not yet. 3 days passed without mention of it. Silas kept to his work, splitting kindling, patching the roof, seen before monsoon, season turned the ceiling to sponge, checking the fence line for signs of antelope pressing through the slats. Nothing about his routine changed, but his mind circled back to that moment in front of the trading post more than he cared to admit. Not because he expected something to come of it. He didn't, but because he hadn't seen her eyes since. And there'd been something in them. Not gratitude, something older. Maybe anger, maybe endurance. That evening, the light fell sharp through the western trees, carving long shapes across the yard. The chickens had roosted early. The mutt hadn't barked all day. Silas had just set down a boiled potato and strip of salted meat on a tin plate when he heard it. 3 short knocks on the frame of his front porch. Not the door, just the outer wood. He reached for his coat, more from instinct than threat. He opened the door slow. There, standing just beyond the threshold, was the old Apache woman, the same one from the trade stop. Her shoulders were straighter than he remembered. The same basket now held wrapped bundles, tied with cord. Behind her stood 2 women, young, mid-20s at most. The one on the left stepped slightly forward. Taller, sharper in the jaw, with eyes that moved fast. She had the look of someone who watched everything at once. The other stayed behind the elder's shoulder, her head tilted down just enough to avoid direct gaze. Her hair was tied in a low braid. Her dress was simple but clean. Silas didn't speak yet. The elder didn't wait for him. "You didn't take anything from me," she said. Her voice was low, shaped by years that gave no room for softness. Didn't ask, didn't demand. Just stood. Silas held the door, but didn't lean on it. "Seemed right," he answered. The elder nodded once. She set the basket on the porch without crossing the threshold. "These are my daughters. This land, you live here without wife. I saw it on your face. You don't belong to anyone. That matters." Silas didn't move. He didn't look past her. She continued. "One of them will stay the night. No trade. No promise. The other, and I will leave before sunup." She turned to go. The taller daughter followed without hesitation. The quieter one remained. Silas finally looked at her directly. She didn't speak, didn't step closer either, just waited. He opened the door wide and stepped back. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded once. Inside, the room held a second chair, but no table. He pulled one crate forward and set the extra plate down. The fire in the stove was low, the heat gentle. She stepped in, closed the door behind her without sound, and stood by the wall. He didn't ask her name, didn't offer his. That could come later. Or not. She didn't touch anything until he pointed to the plate. Then she sat on the crate and ate slow, not from fear, but caution, like every motion had weight. Silas sat opposite her and picked at his own food. The silence wasn't thick. It was just real. He watched the way she scanned the room without shifting her head. How her fingers kept close to the edge of the plate. How her eyes darted once toward the door when the wind outside picked up. She wasn't waiting to be spoken to. She was waiting to see if she was safe. That was something Silas understood without needing it explained. When the meal was done, she stood and set the plate in the tin basin. No words. He pulled out the extra blanket and laid it near the stove, away from the draft. She moved toward it without being told. Sat cross-legged, hands folded over her lap. He doused the lamp, but kept one candle lit. Sat back in the chair by the door. The quiet that settled in wasn't empty. It felt like the start of something they hadn't named, and wouldn't need to. Before the sky turned fully pale, the elder returned to the porch. No words were exchanged. She stood in the yard with the taller daughter beside her, waiting as the light crawled up the ridge behind the cabin. Silas opened the door without rush. He didn't ask if they'd slept, didn't offer coffee. The elder didn't look like she wanted any. The younger woman, still sitting by the stove where she'd stayed through the night, rose to her feet. Her braid was looser now, Her dress looked the same, but her eyes were clearer. She didn't look toward her mother. She looked at Silas. The elder spoke first. She can come now, or she can remain. It's not my word that keeps her. The daughter gave no sign of being pressed. Silas looked at the ground for a second, then up. She's free to stay if that's what she wants. No ceremony followed. The elders simply turned. The taller sister gave one glance over her shoulder, unreadable, then followed. They walked off toward the tree line, the morning dust rising around their steps. No goodbye was said. None was expected. Silas didn't watch long. He stepped aside to let the girl move past the threshold. She stood a moment in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, and then she crossed back inside without hesitation. He poured water into the basin and handed her a clean cloth. She took it with a nod and washed her hands and face with slow, careful movements. She didn't seem unsure, just precise. "Name's Silas," he said after a moment, not expecting her to answer. She looked at him and spoke quiet, clear. "Nita." That was enough. He set a tin plate with bread and beans on the crate again. She sat without needing to be told. Outside, the sky grew brighter. Chickens scratched under the porch again. The dog sniffed near the woodpile and circled back to lie under the wagon frame. After breakfast, Silas gathered his tools for fencing. The southeast post line had taken a beating from last month's wind. He didn't ask Nita to come. She followed anyway, her moccasins brushing dry weeds as they crossed the ridge behind the cabin. She didn't ask questions, but she watched every task with intent. When he drove in a fresh stake, she handed him the hammer. When the rails sagged, she held it steady. She didn't speak, but her movements answered enough. They worked until the sun was overhead, then returned to the cabin in silence. That afternoon, she began sweeping the porch with a gathered bundle of twigs she'd taken from the woodpile. She didn't ask for a broom. She made do with what was there. Silas watched her once through the window, then went back to sharpening the hatchet. Later, she boiled water without asking, poured it into a pan, and cleaned the dishes from that morning. When she was done, she placed each item in its original place without being told where anything went. She remembered. That evening, Silas cooked stew. Not much seasoning, just enough salt to bring the flavor out. He set 2 plates down. They ate with the same quiet as before. After the dishes were rinsed, she folded the blanket neatly and placed it back in the chest at the foot of the bed. Then, without asking, she laid out a straw mat near the stove. She didn't claim space, just took the corner she'd already used. Silas didn't comment. He lit the lamp and sat by the door with a worn tin cup. She sat cross-legged near the warm stove, sewing a small tear along the hem of her dress with careful, even stitches. He spoke once more. "You plan to stay?" She paused, looked up, then nodded once. "Then you can have the bed tomorrow," he said. She blinked, not startled, just surprised by the offer. "I don't need it. I didn't ask if you did. I'm offering." She nodded again. "All right." Then neither said anything else. Outside, the wind picked up, but the house held firm. Inside, the air was steady. Nothing was owed between them. Nothing was forced. And yet, by the time the lamp was blown out, she had not once looked toward the door. The next morning brought a colder wind than the week before. It pushed through the dry trees and carried a silence that wasn't empty, just careful. The chicken stayed close to the coop. The dog didn't bark, didn't pace, just sat on the porch with its ears low. Nita was already outside when Silas stepped into his boots. She was kneeling near the well, checking the bucket rope for frays. She hadn't asked, hadn't been told, but she understood quickly what mattered around here. Her hands worked fast but gently, looping fresh twine through the pulley hook where the old knot had thinned. Silas stood back a moment before speaking. "I usually check that after breakfast." "I'm already here," she answered without looking up. He let it be. Inside, the cabin still smelled faintly of smoke from last night's fire. He cooked oatmeal and set 2 bowls out. She came in just as he was placing the kettle back on the stove. They ate without much talk, but the quiet wasn't strained. Later, they walked the north edge of the property. That part of the fence hadn't been checked in 2 weeks, and Silas didn't like the idea of strays getting in, or worse, people passing through without him knowing. Nita walked beside him, not behind. She carried a coil of wire under one arm and a small hammer in the other. They repaired 3 posts before stopping under cottonwood for water. Silas finally asked, "You from his side of the river?" She shook her head. "We came west last year. Too much bad blood farther east." He didn't press for details. Her tone said enough. By mid-afternoon, a small dust cloud appeared along the far trail. Silas narrowed his eyes, shielding them with one hand. Someone on horseback. One man, riding slow. Nita saw him too. She didn't speak, but her body shifted, weight slightly back, hand tightening near her hip. They returned to the cabin without saying a word. Silas loaded the rifle, but didn't cock it. He placed it by the door. The dog growled once, then fell silent. The rider arrived near sundown. He didn't approach fast, didn't yell out. Just rode up, dismounted, and walked halfway toward the porch. "Evening," the man said. Tall, leather vest, dust-covered trousers. His face was lean, too smooth for the amount of sun he'd ridden under. His boots looked worn, but his belt was polished. He smiled too easily. Silas didn't return the greeting. "Looking for a woman passed through this area," the man said. "Young. Apache. Traveling with an older one. Couple weeks back." Silas kept his hands by his sides. "A lot of folks pass through. I don't keep names." The man tilted his head. "No harm meant. Just tracking a family death. Debt doesn't interest me." The man stepped back half a pace, nodded once, and returned to his horse. As he mounted, he added, "You got a quiet place here. Hard to find quiet men these days." Then he turned and rode back the way he came. Only after the dust had fully settled did Nita step out from the back wall, where she'd stayed still and low. "You knew he was trouble," she said. "Didn't take much guessing," Silas answered. She didn't look shaken, but she didn't sit either. She stood near the door for a long time, her arms crossed, watching the trees. Later that night, she didn't sleep on the floor. Without discussion, Silas had laid out the blanket on the bed and left the chair near the stove for himself. She lay down quietly, eyes open for a time. "Thank you," she said, almost under her breath. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Outside, the wind scraped across the dry boards again. Inside, neither of them closed their eyes right away. Something had shifted, and both knew it wouldn't be the last time a man like that came looking. The 6th morning came without wind, without sound. The sun broke through a thin mist hanging over the yard, casting a pale hue across the dry ground and low brush. Birds didn't stir until later. Even the dog stayed curled beneath the porch, eyes half shut but alert. Inside the cabin, Nita was already folding a strip of clean cloth into narrow bandages. She hadn't mentioned needing them. She just worked, steady and focused, cutting from an old grain sack she had washed 2 days earlier and dried in the shade. She placed each finished piece inside a wooden box she'd cleared from the corner shelf. Silas watched from the doorway, half-buttoning his shirt. "Something I should know?" She didn't look up. Better to have them than not. He nodded once and stepped outside, grabbing the shovel as he passed the threshold. The garden rows needed reshaping. Rains hadn't come in over 2 weeks, and the soil was pulling apart. By the time Nita joined him, he'd already cleared the edge of the second furrow. She carried a small tin cup with her, filled with crushed ash and grit. Without being asked, she knelt and scattered it over the base of the row to hold moisture. Neither said anything. It had become common now. The work done shoulder to shoulder, words only used when needed. She tied her braid tighter before lifting the bucket. Her sleeves were rolled, her hands dry and calloused from the last week of mending, chopping, carrying. She no longer asked where anything went. If it was hers to touch, she fixed it. If not, she left it. Silas noticed the changes. How she moved differently in the cabin. How she no longer checked the window before undressing behind the hanging cloth he'd strung across the corner. How her voice, when she did speak, came more certain. That afternoon, she rearranged the shelves in the kitchen wall. Not carelessly, with order. The coffee tin moved beside the flour. The knives hung instead of lying loose. The firewood stack was pulled tighter, neater. He didn't stop her, but he noticed. At dusk, they sat on the porch without speaking for nearly an hour. The dog rested between them, snoring lightly. In the distance, a coyote yelped once, far off across the ridge. Then she asked, "You ever live with anyone?" He hesitated before answering. Not like this. She waited. He didn't elaborate. She didn't press. They sat longer as the sun slipped behind the canyon wall. Later that night, Nita knelt by the hearth and took the rifle from its hook. She wiped it down with the cloth Silas usually used, slow and careful. When she finished, she reloaded it without looking to him for confirmation. He leaned against the frame of the door, arms crossed. You know how to handle that? I wouldn't be here if I didn't, she said. He didn't question her further. Before bed, she drew 2 lines in the dirt outside the back wall, one pointing toward the trail they'd used to come in, the other angling out toward the dry creek bed. What's that for? Silas asked. If someone's watching, I'll know where they came from by the way the dust shifts. He looked at the faint marks. Simple. Effective. You expecting someone? Not yet. That night, she didn't take the bed. She slept on the floor again, even though the bed was made for her. He didn't ask why. She didn't offer a reason. But she kept the rifle beside her, not loaded, just close. Silas didn't sleep much. Not because of worry. Because he'd begun thinking about what it meant to have someone not just live in your home, but rearrange it, prepare it, guard it. He'd spent years keeping everything the same. Not because he liked order, but because it kept things predictable. Now, the shelves had changed. The dishes sat in different places. The tools were cleaner than he left them. The water barrel had been moved slightly closer to the door. Nothing had been taken from him, but everything around him was becoming shared. He wasn't sure what to make of that. In the dark, Nita shifted in her sleep, the firelight barely catching the edge of her hair. She didn't wake, and he didn't move from his seat by the door until the coals went dim. The wind returned the following morning. Not hard, but with a dry edge, moving in short bursts that tossed loose dirt across the yard and snapped at the ends of the washing line. The sky had a dull, brassy tint. Too early in the season for storms, too late to ignore the signs. Silas stood at the corner of the barn, bracing a panel that had come loose overnight. His shirt clung to his back, soaked from the sweat of hammering in the still heat. Behind him, the mule shifted in its pen, restless, picking at the straw. Across the yard, Nita was boiling water outside instead of inside the cabin, using a cast iron tripod she'd built out of scrap fence posts. She preferred it that way, said she could hear better outside, said the fire burned cleaner in open air. She had already laid out the knives for sharpening, a sewing kit nearby, and the box of dried roots she had ground down in a powder earlier that week. She didn't explain what she was preparing. She just kept working. By mid-morning, a shape appeared on the horizon, small, slow-moving, a figure on foot. Silas lowered the hammer. His hand slid to his hip without rush. Nita stopped grinding. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't go for the rifle this time. She went inside, closed the door, and came out with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, hair tied back, her feet bare for quieter steps. They both stood still as the man approached. He wore a long coat despite the heat. His gait was uneven, as if one leg didn't work quite right. Dust coated his boots, but his face was clean. When he got close enough for features to show, Nita stiffened. Silas watched her first. Her jaw clenched. Her shoulders lifted slightly, but she didn't retreat. The man stopped 10 paces from the porch. I come peaceful, he said, voice low, steady. Ain't here to take nobody. Silas didn't speak. He just stepped slightly forward, placing himself between the man and the front steps. The stranger looked at Nita then, and only then. You left quick. Nita didn't flinch. Didn't owe you goodbye. The man shifted his weight, glanced at the ground. Your mother gave me her word. You were promised. That was her mistake, she said. The man looked towards Silas now, measuring him. This your place? Silas didn't answer. She belongs to me by arrangement, the man added. I fed her family, protected them. This is a matter between us. She belongs to no one, Silas said, eyes steady. The man tilted his head. You mean to stand in the middle of it? Silas nodded once. Already am. The visitor looked past both of them, toward the empty corral, the smoke from the fire pit, the dog pacing quietly near the shed. He saw no sign of threat, but he didn't miss the loaded rifle leaning by the cabin door. You won't see me again, the man said at last. But others might. She's got a name that carries weight. Silas didn't reply. Nita didn't move. The man turned, walked the way he came, disappearing slow across the rise. They didn't speak until the dust behind him had vanished. Nita sat down on the porch. Her hands were shaking. She hid them in her lap. Silas leaned against the post, arms crossed. "I thought he wouldn't come this far," she said quietly. "He won't be back," Silas answered. "I don't think he came for me." Silas frowned. "What then?" "To see if I was claimed." That sat between them for a long time. When she stood, she walked into the house and pulled down the canvas bag she hadn't touched since arriving. She laid on the bed and began sorting through its contents. An old comb, a strip of deer hide with beads, a flint stone wrapped in cloth, a single piece of paper folded twice with faint ink markings. She took the beads and strung them on a new cord. She didn't ask permission. By dusk, the beaded string hung above the bed, tied from the curtain hook. Silas said nothing. He built a stronger latch for the door and packed the rifle with fresh cartridges. After supper, Nita didn't sit by the fire. She brought her blanket to the porch and sat outside, eyes toward the trail, hands gripping the mug of coffee she didn't drink. "You said others might come," Silas said, stepping beside her. "They'll come for what they think I am," she answered. Silas crouched down near the edge of the porch. "And what are you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched the dark. "I'm staying." He looked at her, not surprised, not moved, just quiet. "Not because I owe you," she added. "Because it's mine now, too." That was all she said. She went inside without looking back. He remained on the porch long after the lamp had been turned off. The house behind him was no longer just walls and boards. And the ground under his boots felt different now. Less borrowed, more shared. The wind returned the following morning. Not hard, but with a dry edge, moving in short bursts that tossed loose dirt across the yard and snapped at the ends of the washing line. The sky had a dull, brassy tint, too early in the season for storms, too late to ignore the signs. Silas stood at the corner of the barn, bracing a panel that had come loose overnight. His shirt clung to his back, soaked from a sweat of hammering in the still heat. Behind him, the mule shifted in its pen, restless, picking at the straw. Across the yard, Nita was boiling water outside instead of inside the cabin, using a cast iron tripod she'd built out of scrap fence posts. She preferred it that way, said she could hear better outside, said the fire burned cleaner in open air. She had already laid out the knives for sharpening, a sewing kit nearby, and the box of dried roots she had ground down in a powder earlier that week. She didn't explain what she was preparing. She just kept working. By mid-morning, a shape appeared on the horizon, small, slow-moving, a figure on foot. Silas lowered the hammer. His hand slid to his hip without rush. Nita stopped grinding. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't go for the rifle this time. She went inside, closed the door, and came out with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, hair tied back, her feet bare for quieter steps. They both stood still as the man approached. He wore a long coat despite the heat. His gait was uneven, as if one leg didn't work quite right. Dust coated his boots, but his face was clean. When he got close enough for features to show, Nita stiffened. Silas watched her first. Her jaw clenched. Her shoulders lifted slightly, but she didn't retreat. The man stopped 10 paces from a porch. "I come peaceful," he said, voice low, steady. "Ain't here to take nobody." Silas didn't speak. He just stepped slightly forward, placing himself between the man and the front steps. The stranger looked at Nita then, and only then. "You left quick." Nita didn't flinch. "Didn't owe you goodbye." The man shifted his weight, glanced at the ground. "Your mother gave me her word. You were promised." "That was her mistake," she said. The man looked towards Silas now, measuring him. "This your place?" Silas didn't answer. "She belongs to me by arrangement," the man added. "I fed her family, protected them. This is a matter between us." "She belongs to no one," Silas said, eyes steady. The man tilted his head. "You mean to stand in the middle of it?" Silas nodded once. "Already am." The visitor looked past both of them, toward the empty corral, the smoke from the fire pit, the dog pacing quietly near the shed. He saw no sign of threat, but he didn't miss the loaded rifle leaning by the cabin door. "You won't see me again," the man said at last. "But others might. She's got a name that carries weight." Silas didn't reply. Nita didn't move. The man turned, walked the way he came, disappearing slow across the rise. They didn't speak until the dust behind him had vanished. Nita sat down on the porch. Her hands were shaking. She hid them in her lap. Silas leaned against the post, arms crossed. "I thought he wouldn't come this far," she said quietly. "He won't be back," Silas answered. "I don't think he came for me." Silas frowned. "What then?" "To see if I was claimed." That sat between them for a long time. When she stood, she walked in the house and pulled down the canvas bag she hadn't touched since arriving. She laid it on the bed and began sorting through its contents. An old comb, a strip of deer hide with beads, a flint stone wrapped in cloth, a single piece of paper folded twice with faint ink markings. She took the beads and strung them on a new cord. She didn't ask permission. By dusk, the beaded string hung above the bed, tied from the curtain hook. Silas said nothing. He built a stronger latch for the door and packed the rifle with fresh cartridges. After supper, Nita didn't sit by the fire. She brought her blanket to the porch and sat outside, eyes toward the trail, hands gripping the mug of coffee she didn't drink. "You said others might come," Silas said, stepping beside her. "They'll come for what they think I am," she answered. Silas crouched down near the edge of the porch. "And what are you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched the dark. "I'm staying." He looked at her, not surprised, not moved, just quiet. "Not because I owe you," she added. "Because it's mine now, too." That was all she said. She went inside without looking back. He remained on the porch long after the lamp had been turned off. The house behind him was no longer just walls and boards. And the ground under his boots felt different now. Less borrowed, more shared. The following week brought no riders. No strangers crossed the ridge. No sound echoed from the dry riverbed, but wind scraping across the rocks and the groan of the barn door in the mornings. Yet tension hung across the yard like a stretched rope, never snapping, never slackening. Silas woke before light, boots already beside the cot. He didn't light the lamp. He didn't need it anymore. Every board of the cabin, every nail, every tool had become familiar underhand, even in darkness. He dressed quietly, careful not to disturb Nita. She was still in the bed now. Not always, but often. A line had been crossed without words, and neither of them stepped back. Outside, the frost hadn't broken yet. The grass was pale, tipped with ice crystals. Silas ran one gloved hand along the top rail of the fence. He needed to oil it soon. Cold like this split would if it wasn't watched. Inside the cabin, Nita stirred slowly. When she rose, she didn't wrap herself in shawls or fumble through bags. She tied her braid back with the same cord as the day before and pulled her boots on with practiced ease. She glanced once toward the window before stepping out, hands already holding the kettle. Water needed boiling. Bread needed baking. They had stopped asking each other what needed to be done. They simply did. By mid-morning, Nita was in the garden bed, breaking up the hardened topsoil with a carved iron hose Silas had given her 2 days prior. It had belonged to a man Silas no longer spoke of. He offered it to her without backstory, just a nod, and she accepted it with the same wordless understanding. Silas cut firewood out near the sycamore, where the ground stayed firmer. He chopped slower now, not from age, but because the sound carried far and he liked knowing how it felt to break the silence deliberately. Every swing had weight. Every echo came back clean. Around noon, Nita emerged from the cabin with a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, cornbread, 2 smoked strips of rabbit, and dried apple slices. She handed him the bundle without ceremony, then sat down beside him on a flat stone and pulled her legs up. They ate in quiet bites. When she finished, she didn't rise. Instead, she asked, "What would you have done if I'd left that first night?" Silas took a moment before answering. Would have kept doing the same. Work, sleep, breathe, but would have felt like something got pulled out, not broken, just taken. Nita didn't respond, but her eyes softened. Later that afternoon, they took inventory of what was stored in the shed. Cans of beans, dried herbs, half a barrel of salted pork, and a crate of ammunition. Silas checked each round by hand. Nita relabeled the jars in Apache, muttering the names aloud as she wrote. "Never hurts to know what's yours in your own language," she said, finishing the last label. They hadn't spoken about the man who had come looking, but they both knew it wasn't over. That sort of man didn't walk 30 miles in worn boots to let something go. He had left quietly because he was buying time, not giving it. That night, they burned a second lantern, one in the window, facing the ridge. Not for light, for message. They wanted to be seen. They were no longer hiding. As Silas whittled down a length of pine for drawer rails, Nita took a strip of rawhide and began stitching a sheath for her knife. She worked with speed and precision. Her hands no longer hesitated at corners. She knew what she wanted it to be and how to make it happen. "You thinking of leaving it behind?" Silas asked, nodding toward the knife. She shook her head. "Just want it close in the right way." They didn't lock the door that night. Not out of trust, but out of readiness. They were done living as if someone else owned the space. After the lamps were dimmed, they sat beside the stove, sharing the same blanket. It wasn't for warmth. It was for stillness. Her shoulder against his hand resting on his knee, not touching her but close. "I never thought this was possible," she said after a long while. "What part?" "Staying," she said, without being taken. Silas looked at her, not with pity, not with comfort, just full recognition. "You stayed. That's the difference." When she turned in for the night, she didn't roll toward the wall. She faced the center of the room. Her breathing was calm, even. She didn't reach for the knife. Outside, the trees stood still. No wind, no movement. Even the chickens had quieted early, as if something had settled over the land and asked them to hold their noise. Silas took one last walk around the property before bed. He passed the shed, the barn, the edge of the vegetable rows. Every footstep was placed deliberately. He saw the stones she had stacked along the trail. Small warning markers, like pressure points in the ground. He left them untouched. Back at the porch, he paused. He looked at the sky, at the stars above the ridge, then turned his gaze to the door left slightly open. Lamplight flickered inside. Her presence was visible in every shape. The folded shawl, the water basin full, the fresh loaf cooling on the counter. He didn't need to be told. This was hers now, too. And if someone came, they'd find both of them standing in the way. The final test came just past dusk, 3 weeks after the last visitor. The air held stillness that didn't feel natural. No wind, no insects, not even the usual creak of the barn. The kind of quiet that warned something was waiting. Nita was inside folding clean linens, placing them into a new chest Silas had built from salvaged pine. She had organized the space so thoroughly that there was no more clutter, no more signs of arrival. She lived here now. Her items didn't sit in corners. They had places. Silas had just finished cleaning the rifle again. Not because it needed it, but because he liked knowing it was ready. He oiled the bolt, tested the balance, placed it near the front door, and didn't mention it to her. He didn't have to. Around the same time, the dog started pacing. Not barking, just circling tight, sniffing the ground and looking off toward the ridge. Nita stepped outside with the lantern to see for herself. The light reached only as far as the edge of the shed, but her eyes didn't need it. She could feel it too. Someone was out there. Silas joined her at the top step. He didn't bring the gun. He brought the same still posture he always carried. Shoulders even, hands resting near the belt, chin slightly down. The man they saw approaching had a different walk than the last. Slower, limping. No horse, just dust on boots and something coiled in one hand that caught the lantern glow. Nita narrowed her eyes. "That's not the same one," she said quietly. "No," Silas said. "This one's worse." The stranger didn't raise a weapon. He didn't call out. He stopped 10 yards from the porch and stood in a way that said he knew he didn't need to ask permission. Not yet. Not until someone told him otherwise. Nita moved first. She stepped down the porch, slow but deliberate. "Who sent you?" she asked. The man smiled, dry and joyless. "No one sends me. I'll walk where I want." She didn't blink, then walked the other way. He took one step forward. Heard a woman came out this way. Apache. Not claimed. Not marked. Not married. Silas stepped down now beside her. Not ahead. Not behind. "She ain't alone," he said. The man's smile dropped. "You got papers?" "No one here needs them," Nita answered. He looked between them. "I've bought women for less than what you're offering her. Hell, I've taken them for nothing," when no man spoke up. Silas didn't reach for the rifle. He didn't need to. Then maybe you've been walking in the wrong country. The man shifted. His hand twitched, but something in Nita's posture stopped him. She hadn't moved a muscle, but her weight had centered, her hands low and steady. Her stance said she was ready, and she wasn't waiting on Silas to make the call. "You aiming to die out here?" she asked him directly. That gave him pause. "I've lived through worse," he said. "I haven't," she replied. "But I'm not running again." The wind finally moved then, a slow push that carried the dry smell of dust and wood smoke. The dog growled low, then fell silent again. The stranger held the stare a few seconds longer, then let the rope in his hand fall. It wasn't a weapon, just a length of hemp, frayed and stained. "You're not worth the ride back," he muttered. And he turned. They didn't move until his silhouette faded into the trees. Back inside, Nita washed her hands in the basin and sat on the cot. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She unlaced her boots and looked up at Silas. "I don't need protection," she said, "but I chose to stay because I knew you'd never use me like they did." He nodded. "And I never will." She stared at him a long time, then said, "You still want me here, knowing that?" "Yes." "You sure it's not pity? It's respect." A long silence followed. Then she stood, stepped forward, and placed her hand lightly on his chest. It wasn't a question. It was a decision. They shared no kiss that night, no words of promise. But the bed held both of them now, and the chair by the stove sat empty. By morning, she wore his coat when she stepped outside to feed the chickens. He handed her coffee in the tin cup she now called hers. She hung the beaded cord above the doorway and pinned her knife to the wall beside his. That afternoon, he carved a small wooden plaque. Just one word, Mercer. He didn't ask. He hung it by the doorpost. When the elder woman returned weeks later, she saw the curtain in the window. She saw the garden rose double in size. She saw Anita's shawl folded neatly beside Silas's gloves. The elder didn't ask questions. She stood in the yard for a long time. Then she gave one nod and left without speaking. Later that month, they built a second room onto the back of the cabin. Not because it was needed, but because they could. In a quiet place near the river, far from where names meant power and women were traded like goods, two people stayed. Not for debt, not for safety, but by their own choosing. There was no ceremony, only peace and permanence.